And that then takes us to the pillars of the TCFD and the 11 sub-recommendations of the TCFD's 4 pillars. And I think Saren's going to be presenting on these slides, but I'm going to stop sharing because I'd like to see if there are any questions or comments that anybody would like to raise at this point in time. And also just to check that, who we have with us in terms of the workshop. So Tony Olivier, I think Tony, you joined us earlier and then needed to leave early. Tony, we haven't had an opportunity to meet you. I don't know if you want to just say hi and let us know who you represent.
Hi. Sorry, I'm having a bit of an issue with my camera. I was principal officer on a large umbrella pension fund, and also a trustee on an unclaimed benefit fund. And for that reason, I felt it necessary to become more exposed to the ESG and the whole climate change environment.
Thanks, Tony. Lovely to have you with us for the workshop. I'm so glad you could come back after having to leave a bit earlier. And we hope that the workshop is beneficial. And, we look forward to also hearing some of your practical experience as a principal officer and trustee in terms of your own engagements or, discussions with fund managers around how they're addressing climate risk relative to their investment portfolios. Are there any other individuals who may have joined us late that want to, like Tony, use this opportunity to just introduce themselves and who you represent? Okay, I'll take that as a no. And Saren, I'm going to hand over to you. And I think either towards the end of your session or at the end of your session, we're probably likely to schedule our next break. Thanks very much, Saren.
Thanks, Adrian. Hi, everyone, again. So the next part of today's session, we're going to be jumping into the 4 pillars of the TCFD recommendations and the 11 sub-recommendations. Before we jump in, we want to give you another poll just to hear some feedback from you. So if you don't mind answering the next poll, which should be on your screen now. And this is asking which of the 4 pillars of the TCFD framework are you or your organization least comfortable with? So are you least comfortable with the governance side, the strategy pillar, the risk management pillar, or the metrics and targets? So if you could let us know which pillar you are least comfortable with, that will help us also frame the discussions going forward, so we know where to focus. So we've got governance coming up, risk and risk management. Okay, so those are some areas we will be touching on when we're going through all the pillars, but we go through risk management in a bit more detail as well. So thanks to those who've responded. Going to give it a couple more seconds before we kick off. It's good to get a sense of which pillars are people looking to get more information on, and it's coming up as risk management and governance. Great. So thanks to those who responded. It's good to know where you guys are at, and hopefully the next session will provide some more clearer information on the TCFD pillars and help you in furthering your understanding of those particular pillars where you might be struggling with. So the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, some background on the task force. It was created by the Financial Stability Board, the Global Financial Stability Board, which was then headed up by Mark Carney, which is the former head of the United Kingdom's Reserve Bank. They set up the task force to look at how the financial institutions that are involved in investing, lending, and underwriting should be integrating climate change and climate risk management within the operations. Now, the task force came back and developed the TCFD recommendations, and these recommendations have been widely adopted by many institutions, for companies and regulators globally, and more increasingly in South Africa. And we're going to talk more about the trends in a later session, but it's good to have some background before we jump into the 4 pillars and the 11 recommendations as set out by the TCFD. Now, the TCFD recommendations, while they're very aligned for the financial sector and financial institutions, there is also recommendation and guidance for all sectors, as well as supplemental guidance for certain other sectors. And we're going to be jumping into the 4 pillars now and the 11 recommendations, and highlighting some supplemental guidance that's specific for asset owners like pension funds and retirement funds. Here, this slide shows the 4 pillars, which are governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And it also shows that they, under each target or each pillar, there are sub-recommendations. So this slide might be a bit text heavy and difficult to read, so don't worry about it too much, because we will be going in depth into each of these pillars, as well as the sub-recommendations in the next section. And as Adrian mentioned up front, we will be sharing these slides with the panelists, so you can go through this when you have some time. So we're going to start off with theme 1, which is governance. So the TCFD recommendations for theme 1, governance, is asking for companies to disclose the organization's governance around climate-related risks. Now, before jumping in, I just want to mention that while a TCFD is set up as a reporting or disclosure framework, it's more than that. It's actually a tool. It's a tool for management of companies, or it's a tool for asset owners to reflect on one's own governance, risk management strategy, and their own metrics and targets. So while this next section might seem to be a bit different from what you would expect as a trustee or as a principal consultant, it's good to think about it as reflective questions to ask yourself. So as we get into the first theme 1 around governance, and this is asking about the organization to think about their governance around climate-related risks as well as opportunities. And the first part of the governance theme is speaking about the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. So here, the recommendations from the TCFD is asking for organizations to describe and think about how their board's oversight of climate-related issues and processes, and as well as any committees that are set up, and really asking people to reflect on how the board monitors and oversees their progress against goals and targets for addressing climate-related issues. So the first part of the governance theme is around the board's oversight, and the second part is around management's oversight. So board is a bit more senior, and then we get to the management level, where here it's asking about how it's asking organizations to describe management's role in the assessment and management of climate-related issues. Here, people, or the TCFD recommendations is asking organizations to describe the different committees they have, as well as the level of management, whether it's senior or executive level management, and how they report to board committees, who is responsible for this assessing and managing of climate-related issues, as well as, describing again the organizational structure, the processes which management is informed, and how management monitors and manages climate-related issues. So that's the governance side, which is talking about the board's role, and then the manager's role in managing climate-related risks. And while there isn't supplemental guidance here for asset owners on this governance pillar, it is important to understand that asset owners play a key and influential role within the investment value chain as both the users and sometimes reporters of information. So this could be good information for you as an asset owner to ask for your investment manager to describe how their processes work around climate-related risks and opportunities, how their board plays a role, how their senior management and executive management plays a role in governing and managing climate-related risk within the organization. We then move on to the second pillar of the TCFD recommendations, which is the strategy pillar. Here, the recommendations are asking for organizations to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on organizations' business, strategy, and financial planning. So here, the first part of the strategy recommendations is asking for organizations to think about their climate-related risk and opportunities over different timeframes, which include a short-term timeframe, a medium-term, and long-term. So firstly, organizations should think about what they consider to be the relevant short, medium, and long-term. They should describe the specific climate-related risks for each of those timeframes for the short, medium, and long-term, as well as describing the material financial impact on their organization, as well as thinking about the process used to determine which risk and opportunities have a material financial impact on the organization over the relative timeframes. And organizations should also consider providing a description of their risk and opportunities by sectors and geographies as it relates to the strategy and where is appropriate. The next part of the strategy pillar is asking for organizations to think about how climate change risks and opportunities would affect their products, services, how it would affect their value chain, as well as how it would affect their operating costs, revenues, their capital expenditures, acquisitions, divestments, and even potentially if access to capital would be potentially constrained under different scenarios. Supplemental guidance here provided by TCFD is asking for asset owners to describe how climate-related risk and opportunities are factored into their relevant investment strategies. So I think for the audience today, if you, as a custodian of assets and, having relationships with your asset managers and asset consultants, this is a great piece of guidance here and a framework for the right questions to ask your asset managers in asking them to describe how this is integrated and factored into their investment strategies, and as well as describe the perspective of the total fund investment strategies or individual investment strategies for various asset classes. How do they take into consideration climate change and climate change risks? The third part of the strategy pillar is talking about scenarios. Here, organizations are asked to describe the resilience of their strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. I spoke about 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees earlier on in the introduction to climate change. So hopefully you remember what we spoke about earlier, as that's important to understand this second pillar and the third recommendation, which is about taking into consideration different scenarios and those temperature scenarios. Here, the guidance is for asset owners to perform scenario analysis and consider how these climate-related scenarios are used and how they form the investment decision-making process in specific assets and asset classes. On to the third pillar of the TCFD recommendations, which is about risk management. Here, the TCFD recommends that organizations should disclose how they identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. So here, the first part of this TCFD recommendations for risk management is asking for organizations to describe their process for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. So organizations should describe how they determine what is relevant. They should describe what they consider existing or emerging requirements related to climate change. And they should also consider disclosing the process for assessing the potential size and scope of the identified climate-related risks. And importantly, disclose and think about the terminology you use to reference the existing risk classifications and frameworks we use. So definitions and terminologies of risk classifications, important things to look at under the risk management side of things. Here, there are some supplemental guidance for asset owners. So questions one should ask your asset managers as custodian of assets. The TCFD is recommending that asset owners should describe the level of engagement with investee companies to encourage better disclosure and practices related to climate-related risks, to also improve data availability and the asset owner's ability to assess climate-related risks. So focus here is on active ownership and engagement. Here, the guidance from TCFD is really requesting asset owners to engage with the investee companies, specifically around climate-related risks, as well as the data they provide. The second part of the risk management pillar is asking again for organizations to describe their processes for managing climate-related risks, but specifically here, the questions are around how do they make decisions to mitigate, transfer, accept, or control those risks. So getting deeper into the risk management side of things, how do they mitigate, transfer, accept, and control those risks? Supplemental guidance provided by TCFD here is recommended that asset owners should describe how they consider positioning their portfolio with respect to a transition to a lower carbon energy supply, production, and use. And this could also explain how asset owners actively managing their portfolio, positioning and exposure in relation to the transition to a more sustainable future, to a more climate-friendly future. So we mentioned fossil fuels earlier, we mentioned electricity production, and this, the guidance here provided by TCFD is asking for asset owners to provide more guidance on how they consider that transition and those risks that we mentioned up front for energy and fossil fuels and high emission sectors, how they're managing the risk related to transition away from those sectors into more sustainable sectors. And the last part here under the risk management framework, under the risk management pillar, is to describe the processes for identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks are integrated into the overall organization's risk management process. So it's no good to have a climate change or climate risk management process that's not integrated into the overall organization's management process. So standalone processes are good, but it's important for these processes to be integrated into the overall risk management process of the organization. And that's what the third sub-recommendation of the risk management pillar is asking for. So I know there were some people in the audience today who mentioned that the risk management pillar was one of those that they needed some help on. So hopefully these few slides have provided some additional guidance for you and have enlightened you a bit more about risk management, but please do feel free to pop questions in the chat or raise your hands and jump in. If you have any particular questions, we'll be happy to answer that and help with your understanding of this pillar. But the focus here on the risk management side of things, under these three sub pillars, we've gone through that, and hopefully that's increased your understanding so forth. So I'm just going to go back because I know that people were kind of looking at this pillar. So the first part of the pillar was around the process for organizations in the risk management side of things. The second part, or the supplemental guidance, was here around active ownership and asset managers needing to disclose how they engage with investing companies. The second part of the risk management process was around, again, process, but specifically how they mitigate, transfer, accept, and control for climate-related risks, as well as the supplemental guidance provided here about considering the transition to a low carbon economy. And the last part was about how do asset owners and asset managers integrate the climate risk management process into the organization's overall risk management process. On to the last pillar of the TCFD recommendations, which is around metrics and targets. Here, the TCFD is recommending that organizations disclose both the metrics they use and the targets they use to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. So the first part of the last pillar is asking for organizations to disclose the relevant metrics and metrics that they use. So here, organizations should provide the key metrics used to measure and manage climate-related risks. Organizations should also include metrics on climate-related risks associated with water, energy, land use, and waste management where relevant and applicable. So that's the first part around metrics. There's a difference between metrics and targets, but they are related. So metrics should also provide a historical period for people to do trend analysis. And where not apparent, organizations should provide a description of the methodologies used to calculate or estimate climate-related metrics. And these metrics could be both quantitative and qualitative. So where quantitative metrics are not available, qualitative or descriptions of certain climate-related metrics that are used should be provided. The TCFD also provides some supplemental guidance for asset owners. Here, asset owners should describe the metrics used to assess climate-related risks and opportunities in each of their funds or investment strategies. So you might have an overall organizational level of metrics, but specific for asset owners, one should look at each fund and investment strategy and the metrics and targets used to monitor and manage their climate-related risks, and looking at how these metrics have changed over time. The second part of the fourth pillar around metrics and targets is about disclosing scope 1, scope 2, and where appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and the related risks. So we mentioned scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. This is an important concept for the TCFD as well as climate-related risk management in general. Organizations should provide their scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. And because we are dealing here with financial institutions, scope 3 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are also quite relevant. The organization should also use best practice in measuring their greenhouse gas emissions, and the greenhouse gas protocol or the GHG protocol methodology is probably one of the best methodologies out there, and this is recommended by the TCFD for organizations to use. Here, there's some supplemental guidance provided by TCFD around particular metrics that one can use as best practice. Now, this might be a bit complicated, and I think we've go into this in a bit more detail later on in the slide, but here are some examples of metrics that you can look at, such as weighted average carbon intensity, total carbon emissions, carbon footprint, carbon intensity, and exposure to carbon-related assets. We're going to chat a bit more about that later on, and you'll see that coming through. But the TCFD has provided some guidance for people that are less familiar in the climate change space in terms of metrics that one can ask their asset managers to report on or to look at and to provide data on. The last part of the metrics and target pillar is asking organizations to describe the targets that they use to manage climate-related risks and opportunities and the performance against those targets. Here again, organizations should describe the key climate-related targets, such as those related to greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, energy usage, and others, which are in line with regulatory requirements, as well as other market constraints, and of course, what clients are asking and requesting from them. Other goals may include efficiency or financial goals, financial loss tolerance, such as value at risk, avoided greenhouse gas emissions, revenue goals for products or services designed for a low carbon economy. And some of these might not be so relevant for financial institutions, but certainly goals around financial loss tolerances, as well as greenhouse gas emissions are important. In describing their targets, organizations should include the following. Whether the target is absolute, that means is the target in greenhouse gas emissions tons or CO2 tons, or is it in intensity based? Intensity based means your target is divided by revenue. So you take your absolute and you divide by revenue, and you get a target that's based on tons of CO2 per million rand in revenue. Organizations should also consider the time frame for which the target applies, the base year for which progress is measured against, and key performance indicators used to assess progress against these targets. Luckily for the audience today, we're going to be going into more detail around metrics and targets, because this is a really important part of the TCFD pillars. We're also going to be talking a bit about scenarios later on. So we will be, describing these pillars in a bit more detail coming up. But it's good to firstly start off with a description of the TCFD, the 4 pillars of TCFD, and the 11 sub-recommendations, because as mentioned, this is not just about disclosure. This is a framework, it's a tool. It's useful for asset owners, asset consultants, asset managers, anyone in the financial institution to be reflective questions to ask yourself, your organization, your asset managers, your asset consultants, because these are important metrics and useful tools for helping you in understanding and managing your climate-related risks and opportunities for the future. So the next part of this is a poll. So hopefully you're still with us in there. I know the last part was a bit meaty and a bit content heavy, but we want to still check if you're there, and we want you to engage with us as well. And we want to know from you is, has your organization become a formal TCFD supporter, or are you actively considering taking up the recommendations? So Parker, you could load that poll up for us, please. Okay, so people are not quite sure yet. So hopefully after the end of this webinar, you can go back to your constituents or your organization and your team and put TCFD on the radar as a useful framework to consider as it's becoming more and more important. And we're going to show some trends coming up in the next section. But before we go into the next section, thanks Afako for that poll. We've got one more a poll, and this is going to be to test your knowledge a bit. So which of the following are not one of the 4 pillars of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations? So we discussed in depth the 4 pillars, and we want to know from you if you've been paying attention and if you've learned about these pillars. So if you could let us know which one of these options here is not one of the pillars. Fantastic. So everyone has been listening. So HR management is correct. That is the one that's not the pillar. The 4 pillars are, of course, strategy, governance, risk management, and metrics and targets. So great. Thanks for participating in those polls. You've done really well. You've managed to get those answers right. It's quite easy. So it would have been surprised if you got that one wrong, but great to have you still engaging with us. Okay, so for the next section, I'm going to hand over to Adrian, who's going to take you through an individual exercise using our fact sheets. So thank you all. Adrian, over to you.